The first rounds came in low and mean, buzzing over the riverbed like a nest of hornets. "Contact! High Ridge, 2 o'clock," someone yelled, but the call was almost pointless. Everybody already knew. The dry riverbed had looked like cover on the satellite imagery, a shallow scar cutting through the valley floor, stone walls on either side, scattered boulders that promised concealment. Now it felt like a trap designed by a vindictive god. The walls that had promised protection just pinned them in place, turning every ricochet into shrapnel. Lieutenant Mason hugged the dirt, cheek pressed in a fine gray dust that tasted like old ash. Rounds snapped overhead, each one punching a tiny vacuum into the air, sucking the breath from his lungs. Chips of rock stung his face and neck like thrown gravel. "Machine gun on the spine," Hines shouted from somewhere down the line. "They're walking it left." Mason risked a glance over the lip of his boulder. The high ridge to the north stepped up in broken shelves and jagged outcrops, silhouetted against a washed-out sky. Flashes winked along the crest. Muzzle blasts, flares of orange and white. The heavy gun up there poured tracers down into the riverbed, stitching fire across the shallow twists where his men lay. "Viper actual, this is Viper 1-2. A voice crackled in his ear, chopped by static. "We are." The transmission dissolved into an electronic squeal, the sound rising in pitch until it scraped across his teeth. "Hines!" Mason shouted. "What's wrong with this net?" "No joy on long range." Hines yelled back. "Something's spiking the band. They're jamming us." Perfect, Mason thought. Textbook. We walked into someone else's rehearse scenario. Another sound cut through the gunfire, a dull, distant thump that vibrated through the ground. "Mortar! Incoming!" several voices screamed at once. He curled tighter behind his rock as the first round hit upstream. The blast punched the air out of the riverbed, turning it into a pressure wave of dust and shattered stone. Shrapnel whined away in all directions. The second round dropped behind them, exploding in a geyser of rock that echoed off the walls. Smoke rolled down the shallow channel, folding over itself and pooling where the air was trapped. In seconds, the clear morning turned into a choking gray tunnel. They weren't just dumping rounds randomly. The pattern was too clean. "They've got this whole damn wash prearranged," growled Senior Chief Navarro, sliding in beside Mason with a grunt. "Somebody's been watching us for days." Navarro's face was lined and calm, even with rounds smacking into the rock above their heads. His beard was flecked with gray, his eyes sharp. Mason swallowed the metallic taste of adrenaline. "Options. Options are bad," Navarro said evenly. "We stay, we get pounded flat. We run, the high ground eats us alive." He nodded toward a break in the riverbank, a faint sloping cut that led toward a spur of rock, maybe 50 meters away. It wasn't much, but it was higher than the wash, and its angle might give them some defilade from at least one of the guns on the ridge. "Get a team moving that way," Navarro said. "If we can get under their main gun, we can—" He never finished the sentence. Another mortar round hit, closer this time, the blast slamming into them like a giant hand. Mason's ears rang. Dust poured over them like powdered concrete. Someone down the line screamed, the sound thin and high. "We gotta move," Mason shouted, voice weirdly muffled to his own ears. Navarro nodded once, already half up. "I'll walk him. You keep him honest." He scrambled into a crouch and ran, hunched, along the inner lip of the riverbed, boots skidding on gravel. Machine gun fire chased him instantly, gouging chunks out of the rock inches above his head. He grabbed the back of a younger operator's plate carrier and hauled him toward the spur, shoving him ahead. "Move, move, move," Navarro bellowed, his voice a rolling thunder that somehow cut through everything. Another mortar dropped at the far end of the wash. Another. They were tightening the noose. Mason forced himself upright, just enough to fire a short burst toward the crest, aiming at the nearest muzzle flash. The shots felt futile, swallowed by distance and dust. Something answered from the ridge, a strafing burst that cracked around his position, one round pinging off the edge of his rock and ricocheting into the air with an angry moan. He dropped back down, heart thumping. "Man down," someone shouted. "Chief is hit." Mason turned in time to see Navarro crumple mid-stride, his body twisting as if someone had yanked his legs out from under him. The operator he'd been dragging fell with him. Both lay still. No. Mason was already moving, crawling as fast as he could in a crouched shuffle, bullets chasing his shadow. He slid in beside Navarro and grabbed his vest. The chief's left side was a mess of torn fabric and blood. He was conscious, jaw locked, breath hissing between his teeth. "Don't look at it," Mason said automatically, pressing a hand over the wound. "Hey, eyes on me." Navarro fixed him with a stare. Even with pain burning in it, there was iron there. "You're calling it now," Navarro rasped. "You hear me? You're it." Mason wanted to argue, wanted to shove the responsibility back into those grizzled hands that had guided this platoon its whole deployment. Instead, he just nodded, throat tight. "I've got it," he said. "But you're not done. You stay with me, Chief. That's an order." Navarro gave the ghost of a grin. "Yeah? Put it in writing." Another round whumped in the distance, the air sucking in just before it came down. Mason dropped flat as the mortar landed uncomfortably close, shockwave rippling through his chest. He felt the concussion more than heard it, like someone had clapped a giant hand against his ears. When the ringing faded, the world sounded thinner, more fragile. He risked a glance toward the prefab structure tucked against the base of the northern ridge, their forward medical and comms hut. A small, boxy thing, more shipping container than building. Its walls were already pocked with shrapnel scars from earlier rounds. Inside, Hines had tied into the long-range kit, bouncing their signals up to the satellite link. Inside, their drone feeds and encrypted uplink had displayed the valley and beyond, tying them to higher. A mortar round dropped almost lazily toward it, as if guided by a hand. The blast ripped through one corner of the hut, peeling the metal skin away like a kin lid. The satellite dish on the roof snapped apart and flew into the air, trailing cables like snapped tendons. For a second, sparks flickered where the wiring tore loose. The screens inside went black. The faint hum of generators sputtered out. Whatever thin line they'd had to the outside world was gone. "Comms hut is hit," Hines shouted unnecessarily. "Long range is down. Everything's down." It shouldn't have mattered right in this second. They were already jammed. But seeing that physical symbol of connection destroyed sent a cold little wave through the platoon. It made the isolation concrete. Mason's radio hissed once, an ugly burst of distorted noise, and then fell utterly silent. For a heartbeat, the battlefield felt eerily quiet inside his headset. Just his own breathing, the rapid drum of his heart, and the muffled echo of gunfire bleeding through the plastic. On the ridge above, figures moved with careful intention. He could see them now between gusts of smoke, a man raising some kind of reflective device, flashing quick signals downslope. Another responded with hand gestures, adjusting the line of a machine gun. Farther back, shadowy shapes clustered around what could only be a mortar tube, working in an efficient rhythm. No wild spray, no panic bursts. These guys had studied this ground. They were running a play they'd run in their heads 100 times. "Sir," a younger operator slid in beside him, voice pitched high with adrenaline. "They're setting up something at the far end." Mason twisted, focusing down the wash. Through the dust, he saw a small team near the riverbed's narrowest point. One man knelt, bracing a launcher on his shoulder, while another loaded a fat warhead into the tube. Rocket-propelled grenade. At this angle, in this confined channel, it would be like dropping a grenade inside a tin can full of glass. "RPG team," Mason yelled. "Into the wash. All guns, all guns." Weapons all along the line tried to answer, firing in short, controlled bursts. But the RPG team was half wrapped in smoke and shadow, half hidden by a kink in the riverbed. Rounds sparked off rock, knocked chips from the wall, but the enemy team kept working, heads low, calm as if on a range. The gunner settled the launcher to his shoulder. He rose slightly, settling into his firing stance, aiming straight down the wash, straight into the densest cluster of trapped Americans. Mason didn't have time to think of anything except, this is it. This is where we get erased. And then the world cracked. One rifle shot cut through the storm of noise, clear and distinct, higher in tone than the heavy machine guns, sharper than the carbines, like a whip crack over a thunderstorm. The RPG gunner jerked as if yanked by an invisible wire. A small, neat red hole bloomed just above the collar of his vest. The launcher slipped from his hands as his knees gave out, his body folding forward in slow motion. The loader's head snapped up, eyes wide, just in time for a second shot to punch through the side of his neck. He went down clutching at the wound, blood spraying between his fingers. Where the hell did that come from? Hines breathed. Mason's brain tried to triangulate. The angle of the impacts, the way the bodies moved. Those shots hadn't come from the wash. They'd come from higher, slanting across the riverbed from a completely different vector. He scanned the ridge, hunting for muzzle flash. The crest was a jagged line of rock and dust and muzzle bursts. Somewhere above and beyond them, maybe or tucked into the broken lower shelves. Another shot sounded, that same precise crack. On the northern crest, one of the enemy machine gunners staggered back from his weapon, chest snapping open. The gun's stream of fire cut abruptly, the barrel smoking as it sagged. The spotter beside him dove behind a rock, then tried to peek over with binoculars raised. The rifle spoke again, and the binoculars flew from suddenly limp hands, the man collapsing out of sight. Navarro, still bleeding beside Mason, let out a painful chuckle. "Well, look at that," he rasped. "They're getting some of their own medicine." Mortar fire, which had been marching in a relentless tempo, suddenly went offbeat. One round landed wild, far beyond the riverbed. The next fell short, kicking up dust 30 meters from anyone. Without a spotter, the crew was firing blind. Mason squinted up through the dust and heat shimmer. On the ridge, enemy fighters were moving differently now, less confident, more frantic. He caught a glimpse of a man clutching a radio, shouting into it, looking over his shoulder toward the far slope. Another rifle shot. The radio man dropped like someone had cut his strings. Whoever was out, there was picking specialists, gunner, spotter, comms, like they were reading from the same handbook Mason had studied. Ghost sniper, someone muttered in awe over the short-range net. We got ourselves a ghost. The line, born half as a joke, stuck to the air. Men clung to it, a small talisman against the ugly math of their situation. A ghost meant something outside the expected, something helping them that the enemy couldn't see and couldn't plan for. Use it, Mason snapped, seizing the opening. All elements, move the wounded now. You feel the pressure lower, you move. Get in behind that shelf. The survivors surged into motion, every second counted in blood. Men grabbed plate carriers and ankles, hauled bodies through dust and shell craters, teeth clenched, muscles burning. Rounds still snapped overhead, but the wall of fire had thinned just enough. It went from impossible to barely survivable, and that was the kind of margin men like these lived on. Mason hooked his arms under Navarro's, ignoring the hot stickiness soaking into his sleeves, and dragged. Navarro grunted once, then bit it off, jaw locked, so tight a vein bulged in his neck. "Come on, Chief," Mason panted. "This is the part where you complain about my form." "Your drag sucks," Navarro gasped, which Mason took as a small victory. They made it under the boulder shelf, a protrusion of rock that capped a shallow recess in the riverbank. It didn't look like much, but it put a layer of stone between them and the majority of the high-angle fire. Men piled into the cramped space, bodies overlapping, weapons propped where they could. Hands went to work automatically. Tourniquets cinched. Gauze pressed to wounds. Morphine auto-injectors snapped. Fear rode behind their eyes, but their movements were precise, drilled, ruthless. Mason pressed Navarro's wound harder, feeling for an exit, mentally calculating blood loss against distance to medevac that currently did not exist. "We're going to need that aid station," Navarro groaned. "If it's still there." Aid station. Mason's gaze tracked back to the prefab building. The hut was a wreck. One corner was peeled open, the white insulation blackened and hanging in tufts. Smoke poured from the opening, thicker now, darker. The satellite dish lay in the dirt like a dead insect. Through the distorted heat and dust, he thought he saw movement at the doorway. A silhouette, just for a second, as the smoke thinned and then swirled again. The figure was small compared to the doorframe, armored up but not quite as bulky as the shooters in full kit. A medical cross patch stood out on the vest, dark red against tan, stark and unmistakable. "Doc, the corpsman." Mason blinked, trying to bring the image into focus. It didn't make sense. She should have been inside, tending whoever had taken a hit when the round struck. She shouldn't have been anywhere near. Another burst of gunfire hammered into the rock above their shelter, showering them with dust. Mason flinched, eyes squeezing shut instinctively. A round smacked the lip of the shelf right above him, blowing a spray of powdered stone straight into his face. The world went gray-white, then black. It felt like someone had thrown a handful of glass into his eyes. He shouted, more surprise than pain, hands flying up too late. "Lieutenant!" Hines grabbed his vest, yanking him back deeper under the overhang. "You good? Hey, stay with me." "I can't." Mason tried to open his eyes. Burning. Nothing but slick darkness and a sense of grit grinding under his eyelids. Panic fluttered in his chest. "I can't see." "Flash blindness, dust," someone said. "You're all right, sir. Just keep your eyes closed. We'll flush him when we can." The world narrowed to sound and touch. The stamp and drag of boots. The ragged breathing of men who just done far more than their lungs were designed for. The distant, crisp punctuation of that other rifle, still firing somewhere above, somewhere beyond. In his mind, one image kept trying to play again, like a stuck frame on a screen. A figure in a ruined doorway, a medical cross framed in smoke, standing between the shattered comm's hut and the ridgeline. He couldn't reconcile it, not yet. Couldn't link the doc who checked their vitals before patrols to the invisible hand that was suddenly rewriting the math on this battlefield. The darkness inside his closed eyes thickened, edged with static. His thoughts frayed. Last thing he heard before it all slipped away was Hines's voice, low and shaky, half on comms and half to himself. "Whoever you are up there," Hines murmured, "keep doing what you're doing." Somewhere above them, lungs drew in a steadying breath. A finger tightened on a trigger, and a medic who wasn't supposed to be behind a rifle sight settled the stock into the pocket of her shoulder like she'd never forgotten how. 12 hours earlier, the valley looked almost pretty. The hello came in low over the water, rotors chopping the morning air into a churning roar. Salt spray flashed in the sunlight as the aircraft banked inland, following the line of a narrow coastal gorge that threaded between steep, scrub-dotted hills. From above, the forward outpost looked like a toy set someone had dropped on the valley floor. A cluster of HESCO barriers, a scattering of shipping container buildings, a couple of tents, and the pale rectangle of a landing pad scratched into the dirt. On one side of the compound, a small corrugated structure bore a painted red cross. On the other, a taller prefab building bristled with antennas and a satellite dish, cables running down its sides into a generator hut. "Welcome to the edge of the world," the crew chief shouted over the rumble, tapping the shoulder of the corpsman in the seat beside the cargo door. "Try not to die here." She flashed him a look that was mostly eyes over her dust mask. "You first." When the skids hit dirt, she was already up, grabbing the nearest med crate and muscling it toward the open ramp. She moved with the smooth efficiency of someone who'd done this a lot. Weight centered, back straight, using momentum instead of brute force. "Come on, Doc, you're making us look bad," one of the SEALs called as he hopped down with his own load. "Then move faster," she shot back, not bothering to look. They called her Doc because every medic was document. The name on her plate carrier said Rivera, but almost no one used it. To them, she was the one who checked lungs and pupils, who complained about hydration, who could recite the contents of each med pack in the platoon like a grocery list. She'd arrived in theater 2 months earlier, plugged into their rotations like a new piece of equipment. She ran the small clinic, managed casualty evacuation protocols, and when they rolled out on missions, she went where the risk calculus said a medic should. Today, that meant the outpost. She hauled the last crate off the bird and set it down in the shadow of the aid station. The hello lifted away in a blast of hot rotor wash and dust that whipped her ponytail and plastered her shirt to her back. As soon as the noise faded, The relative quiet of the valley settled in. A few local kids watched from outside the wire, their eyes big. Two goats argued over a scrap of cardboard. Farther upslope, a few mud brick houses clung to the hillside like barnacles. She took it in automatically, cataloging. "Doc." Mason strode toward her from the command post, helmet clipped to his belt, sleeves rolled high on his forearms. He looked exactly like worried lieutenants tended to look, too young for the weight on his shoulders, trying hard not to show it. "Sir," she said, wiping dust off the label of a crate. "Your medical resupply, and your highly attractive company." He cracked a smile. "Just what we needed. We're spinning up for a patrol into the village this afternoon. Local leadership wants a shura before the next big resupply convoys come through. I want you on station here for any walk-ins and to mind the toys." He jerked his thumb toward the comms hut. "Toys," she echoed. "Our drone feeds, our uplink, all the fun stuff," he said. "We're a relay for the birds watching that choke point north of here. Intel thinks the bad guys might test the route in the next week or so. We watch, we report, we look pretty for satellite." She nodded, filing that away. Clinic and comms in one place. Med patch and server racks sharing a wall. "Who's manning the screens?" she asked. He pointed to a skinny kid in Chris gear, carrying a laptop like it was a holy relic. Petty Officer Klein, fresh out of school and in love with every pixel. "You two will share the shack. Try not to fight over shelf space." She snorted. "Long as he doesn't bleed on my exam table, we're good." Mason clapped her on the shoulder, already turning away. "Help yourself to coffee if it hasn't killed anyone yet." Brief and 20 in the ops tent. She watched him go, then turned back to her crates. She had blood products to inventory, bandages to sort, and exactly zero intention of letting this place be the one where she ran out of something she needed. Inside the aid station, the air was cooler. The metal walls held the chill from the night, and someone had rigged a small fan that pushed a lazy breeze across the room. There were two cots, a collapsible exam table, a refrigerator unit humming in the corner, and a battered metal locker with a red tape cross on it. She started unpacking. For bags, antiseptic, chest seals, airway kits. She spoke under her breath as she stacked and counted, anchoring herself in the rhythm. 4 units, O negative. 2 PRBC. That's light for a platoon, and partner forces if things go sideways, she muttered. "I don't like it." She made a note on her clipboard to harass supply again. Under the last row of gauze, something else sat in the crate. A vacuum-sealed roll with a familiar weight. She slit the plastic open and shook out a sling. Not a medical one. Rifle. She ran the strap through her fingers. Plain, no brand logos, sturdy stitching. Her chest flickered with something half fond and half sick. Knock it off, she told herself, and shoved the sling aside. By the time the brief started, she'd already walked the perimeter once. The outpost sat in a bowl at the valley's widest point, with hills rising on 3 sides and the sea at its back. From the seaside, it was approachable only by air or a narrow track hacked into the cliff. From inland, half a dozen goat trails braided into the main dirt road. It was, she had to admit, beautiful. It was also a sniper's playground. At the brief, Mason outlined the plan on a laminated map spread over a folding table. The patrol would escort a local militia commander, Kareem, a man they'd worked with before, back to the village for a meeting with elders. They wanted to reassure the locals the route would stay open, that the foreign soldiers weren't just another temporary storm passing through. "Same path as last time," one of the SEALs said, tapping the map. "Down the wash, up through the wadi, in through the south edge." "Pattern of life, gentlemen," Navarro said from Mason's shoulder. "Ours, not theirs. Don't make it easy on the wrong people." Doc stood at the edge of the group, arms folded, listening. The plan was solid on paper. Rehearsed, even. It was also comfortable. Maybe too comfortable. As the brief wrapped, she looked beyond the Hesco wall toward the village. Instead of the usual litter of kids and stray dogs, she saw carts. Families were loading up what they could, bundles on donkeys, baskets perched on heads, sacks of grain slung over shoulders. People moved with quiet urgency, eyes averted from the base. She stepped closer to the gate, frowning. "Hey, she said to the young Afghan interpreter beside her. That's not market day, right? He shook his head. No, document market is 2 days from now. So why is everyone in such a hurry to be somewhere that isn't here? He hesitated. Maybe rumor of fighting. Maybe something else. People hear things. What things? She pressed. He shrugged, looking suddenly fascinated by his own boots. Sometimes they are told to be gone from certain places at certain times. They do not ask why. Her fingers tightened on the clipboard. That itch between her shoulder blades, the one she'd learned to trust, flared. She found Mason as he stepped out of the tent, map rolled under his arm. Sir, she said, your neighbors are bugging out. He followed her gaze, watched a woman ushering 3 kids along with a hand on each small back, never glancing toward the Americans. Watched a man half carry, half drag a goat that clearly didn't want to go. Could be rumors, he said, but his voice lacked conviction. Could be, she agreed. Or it could be somebody told him not to be here when something ugly happens. He rubbed the back of his neck. Intel didn't flag anything major for today. Intel also didn't flag my blood supply being this low. I'm still not happy about that, she said lightly, then let the words settle. I'm just saying I don't like the mood. He studied her for a second. You have a bad feeling? I have a bad pattern, she corrected. People leave. Militia commander shows up with different guys than usual. You're taking the same pretty little walk you took last week, right on schedule. Just keep your head on a swivel out there. He half smiled. Yes, ma'am. I mean it, she said softer. His expression shifted, something more serious sliding into place. Duly noted. I'll adjust the spacing. We'll throw in some random halts, change up the order. Good, she said. And if your gut starts screaming, listen to it. That goes both ways, he said. If you see anything here that feels off, you call it in. She tapped her headset. Assuming your toys are playing nice. He laughed and moved off to prep his team. Later, as the sun leaned toward the ridgeline, a gentle breeze slid through the outpost, carrying the sound of distant children's laughter. A few local kids, slower to leave, came to the clinic gate. One of them had a scraped knee. Another held a toddler with a cough. Doc knelt in the dirt outside the aid station and rinsed a small wound with saline. The little boy hissed, but didn't cry. She handed him a wrapped candy from her pocket when she finished, tapping the bandage lightly. There, she said, pointed to her own knee, then his since his English was spotty. Match! He grinned, gap-toothed, and scampered off, waving the candy like a trophy. Behind her, boots clanged on the metal ladder to the roof. She glanced up and saw the platoon's designated marksman, Ruiz, climbing to his overwatch position. On the rooftop, a long rifle lay on its mat, stock aligned with the parapet, optic glinting briefly in the light. She found her hand resting on the edge of the mat before she realized she'd walked over. Her fingers drifted to the rifle's sling, straightening it. She thumbed the safety, checked the bolt, the way muscle memory had taught them to check. The balance was familiar in a way that made her throat tight. Nice glass, she murmured, studying the optic. What did they give you, Ruiz? 14 power. He pulled himself over the parapet and saw her. Hey, document don't get too attached to my girlfriend, yeah? She forced a smile, stepping back. She's all yours. You know your way around one of these? He asked, half teasing. She shrugged. Once upon a time. Different life. Anytime you want a spot for me, I'll trade you, he said. You can have my back pain. I'll pass, she said. He chuckled, moving past her to settle behind the rifle. Good. I like my job security. As she descended the ladder, she passed a section of the outer wall where the concrete blocks bore faint scarring. Small, circular pox in a tight cluster about head height if someone had been standing in the yard. She stopped and touched one with her fingertips. Fresh, she thought. Not older than a week or 2. Maybe less. Someone had been ranging this place, testing distances, checking drops. She caught Mason on his way to the gate, where Kareem and his men waited with their battered pickup and mismatched rifles. Could be nothing, she said quietly, but I found some fresh impact marks on the outer wall. Clean cluster. Too clean. Training fire, he suggested. If you've been having people shoot this close to my aid station without telling me, we're going to have words, she said. Besides, the locals don't have groups this tight. Not most of them. He glanced past her at the wall, then back at her face. There was that flicker again, the one where he balanced her concern against the million other inputs screaming for his attention. "I'll log it," he said. "We'll throw a little more weight on the overwatch. Ruiz will earn his paycheck." She wanted to push harder, but she also knew what too much noise from a medic could sound like in a combat zone, like nerves instead of data. So she let him go. At the evening shura, she rode in the back of a truck with the teams, med kit by her knees. The meeting itself was tedious and delicate in equal measure. Elders spoke in long, looping metaphors about rivers and mountains. Mason answered with careful assurances and crisp promises. Kareem translated back and forth, wearing his easy smile and making small jokes that smoothed over any awkward phrasing. Doc sat off to the side in the packed room, checking on the child with the cough, listening to the flow of words without needing every detail translated. She caught tone, tension, the way hands flexed on knees. Halfway through, Kareem's usual two bodyguards slipped out. When new men slipped in to take their place, she noted the swap. These men stood differently. Their eyes did not linger on the floor in deference. They measured exits. She leaned toward the interpreter. "Those two new guys. You know them?" He frowned. "No, maybe from another valley." One of the new guards whispered something to the other. Doc caught just two words in the local tongue, spoken under the murmur of the room. "Night delivery." She filed it away, a little shard of ice in her stomach. Back at the outpost, under a sky dusted with stars, she patched a split knuckle on Mason's hand where he'd clipped it on a doorframe. "Your villagers are packing their lives," she said as she worked. "Your ally shows up with new friends, and someone whispers about night delivery. You sure you don't want to call for a little backup on your backup?" He flexed his fingers as she taped the gauze. "Our window for extra assets is tight. We're already low priority. Hire doesn't love it when we cry wolf." "What if it's not a wolf?" she asked. "What if it's something bigger?" He met her eyes. For a moment, the easy lieutenant mask slipped. "You thinking bait?" "I'm thinking the clinic and the comms hut share a wall," she said. "And you just told me we're the relay for eyes on a choke point that matters to people who like blowing things up." He exhaled slowly. "We'll assume worst case. I'll adjust the guardian angel posture on the base. Extra eyes up, more staggered watch." "That's something," she said. Later, in the quiet of the aid station, she did her last checks. For lines coiled and ready. Med bags packed and positioned. Cases of spare ammo stacked neatly in the corner by the door because out here, bullets and bandages live together. Her gaze drifted to the ladder that led to the roof access. She could see, in her mind, the long rifle resting up there. See the valley laid out in front of it like a shooting lane on a range. Her hand tightened around the stethoscope hanging around her neck. The metal felt suddenly heavy. She opened her locker and, after a minute, took out a small, worn patch. It had once been crisp and green, a symbol of a course most didn't pass. The edges were frayed now, the stitching slightly loose. She sat on the edge of the cot and turned it over in her fingers. She remembered the smell of that other range, thousands of miles away, the heat rising off the sand, the weight of the rifle in her hands. The instructor's voice in her ear. The cracked shout when something went wrong. Someone stepped where they weren't supposed to. A shot broke where it wasn't meant to break. The way the casualty's blood had soaked into the dirt, turning powder to mud. The way she had frozen, finger-locked, unable to take another shot. "Doc," a young partner force soldier poked his head in, pulling her back. "You okay?" She snapped the locker shut, the patch tossed inside like something burning. "Yeah," she said. "Just making sure we're ready for tomorrow." He nodded and left. She locked the door behind him. On her way to lights out, she passed the roof ladder again. Her hand hovered halfway to the rung, fingers curling as if to pull herself up. Instead, she turned away and snapped the interior bolt on the hatch. It felt, in that moment, like turning away from her own reflection. Ambush on the ridge when the trap springs. Dawn seeped into the valley as a thin gray wash, turning the ridge lines into paper cutouts. The air was cool, with a hint of salt and dust. The patrol stepped off in staggered file, boots crunching softly on the hard-packed earth. Mason led near the front, Kareem not far from his elbow, chatting about some minor clan dispute as if this were any other walk. Navarro took the rear, eyes flicking from ridge to ridge. The rest of the platoon spread through the shallow bends of the dry riverbed that would carry them partway toward the village. Back at the outpost, Doc moved through her morning ritual. She checked the fridge, confirmed the temperature, reviewed her casualty plan, mentally tracing the route from the outpost to the nearest surgical facility, made sure the litter straps weren't tangled. In the comms hut next door, Klein hummed to himself as he tapped through menus on his console. Drone feeds flickered across the screens, grainy infrared images of the valley, the road, distant hilltops. Icons blinked green in the corner of the display, showing uplink status, satellite alignment, all the invisible lines that tied this lonely spot to a larger machine. Everything talking to everything. Doc asked from the doorway. Everything loves everybody, Klein said. We're wired. She nodded and stepped back out into the yard, squinting at the light creeping over the ridge. Her radio crackled. Viper actual to Guardian, crossing checkpoint Alpha. Guardian copies, she replied automatically. You're clear from here. It was all normal. Routine. Exactly as it should have been. She hated it. In the wash, Mason adjusted his spacing. The last echo of her warning lingered in his head. He staggered the patrol more than he usually would, splitting his elements, adding small unpredictabilities to the route. Change it up, he called back when Navarro gave him a questioning look. I'm not giving anyone a clean line if I can help it. Navarro grunted approval. Ahead of them, the wash narrowed, the walls rising a little higher, the bottom turning rockier. Kareem's men, walking just a bit too stiffly, led the way with their mismatched rifles. As the patrol moved into the tighter section, Mason's radio hissed. Viper actual, this is Guardian. Doc's voice came through. We're picking up some faint interference spike on the band. You doing anything funky with your kit? He frowned. Negative, Guardian. All standard. You seeing anything else? Not yet, she said. Just feels like static on the line. I'll keep an eye on it. In the yard, she tapped the side of her headset, then walked to the edge of the compound, scanning the ridges. Men on the perimeter yawned, sipped coffee, adjusted scopes. Probably nothing, she muttered. Probably just atmospheric. On his screen, Klein frowned at a faint line of code scrolling where it shouldn't. What are you doing? He murmured to the ether. The patrol reached the choke point. The wash narrowed further, the walls coming in just enough to channel movement. The floor dipped slightly, then rose. It was the same path they'd used last week and the week before. The same path that had felt safe, then safer by repetition. Kareem's men slowed. One of them touched his ear, as if adjusting an earpiece he didn't have. Another glanced up at the ridge, then back at Kareem. The militia commander gave Mason a wide grin. Almost there, he said. Mason's gut clenched. Navarro, he said quietly into his mic, collapsed the spacing just a hair. I don't like this bottleneck. Instead of Navarro's voice, all he heard was a shriek of white noise that punched straight through his skull. He winced, jerking the headset away. What the? Back at the outpost, Doc heard the same thing. Her radio emitted a piercing, rising squeal like a feedback loop. Klein flinched at his console as warning icons flashed red across his displays. Jamming, he said aloud, cold creeping into his voice. That's not weather. That's deliberate. Someone just lit up the band. He reached for the switch to hop frequencies. Before he could flip it, the entire screen flickered. Doc, he shouted. We got. His words cut off as the humming generator behind him coughed, stuttered, and then surged. The lights dimmed. Something on the satellite uplink overloaded with a loud pop. In the wash, Mason yelled into his mic, Guardian, this is Viper actual. Say again your last. The squeal cut out in an instant, replaced by nothing at all. Silence in his ear. His short-range net still carried the voices of his men, but the long-range link to the outpost and beyond had gone dark. Sir, one of the SEALs asked, you getting anything? He shook his head once. Local net only. Stay frosty. He looked at Kareem. The militia commander's smile had faded. His expression smoothed out, became something harder. Mason's stomach dropped a few inches. He opened his mouth to say something. Anything to reset the moment. Kareem's rear guards moved first. The two men in the back rank, who had been chatting amiably just seconds before, pivoted in perfect sync. Their rifles came up not toward the ridge, but toward the Americans. The first burst took the nearest SEAL in the back, rounds punching through his vest at close range, throwing him face first into the dust. The second burst cut across the formation, hitting another man in the side, a third in the leg. Navarro roared an obscenity, snapping his weapon up even as he flung himself sideways. All along the ridge above them, rifles opened up. The wash became a blender. Bullets hammered down from both sides, ricocheting wildly. Splinters of rock filled the air. Mason dropped instinctively, grabbing the back of Kareem's collar as he fell and dragging the commander down with him. More on reflex than trust. Half a second later, he cursed himself for it. But the decision was already made. "Contact rear and high," he bellowed. "Break contact, break." His words drowned in the din. Back at the outpost, the first mortar round landed near the perimeter. The blast ripped a gap in the outer Hesco wall and sent a fireball briefly licking into the air. Sandbags flew like pillows. Doc felt the ground jump under her boots. She staggered, one hand catching the doorframe of the clinic. Another distant thump made her teeth rattle. "Mortars," she said to no one. "They're dropping mortars on us." She sprinted toward the comms hut. Inside, Klein was yelling into a dead microphone. The screens that had shown drone feeds were flickering and filling with static. In a corner of the display, code crawled where it shouldn't, like digital rot. Some external signal was hammering at the system, trying to force its way in. "They're trying to penetrate the network," Klein shouted. "If they get into the relay, they could—" He didn't finish. The lights dimmed again, then steadied. "Klein," Doc said sharply. "Can you keep them out?" He stared at the code, jaw clenched. "Maybe, but we'll lose eyes while I do it. I have to sever the uplink." "Do it," she said instantly. "We're already blind. I'd rather we stay blind than somebody else sees through our eyes." He hesitated for half a second too long. She grabbed a chair and spun him. "Do it." Okay. He stabbed a sequence of commands. On the screen, the satellite icon winked out. The connection dropped. He shut down the system manually, pulling a breaker. The fans in the machine spun down, the room suddenly quieter. Now they were truly alone. Another mortar hit, closer, the blast wave shuddering through the metal walls. Dust trickled from the ceiling. Klein's chair jolted. He looked at Doc, pupils huge. "What now?" "Now we make sure we're not a soft target," she said. "Get to the interior. That thing is a magnet while it's still standing." He grabbed a personal weapon from the rack by the door, hands shaking. Outside, the outpost was waking up hard. Men dove for cover, shouting. A guard tower on the perimeter took a near miss and toppled partially, the soldier inside tumbling out in a clatter of gear and curses. A vehicle parked near the gate exploded, flames boiling up as its fuel tank cooked off. Rounds slapped into the walls, searched for gaps. Doc ran toward the fallen soldier from the tower. He lay groaning, one arm twisted under him. Blood matted his hair where he'd clipped the concrete. "I got you," she said, dropping to her knees. The world narrowed to him for a moment. Airway, breathing, circulation. Spine precautions. "Doc, we got to get under something," he gasped. "They're bracketing us." Another mortar hit the near side of the comms hut. Not quite a direct strike, but close enough. The blast ripped open a side panel and punched a series of holes in the satellite dish mount. Sparks flew. A brief gout of smoke belched from the hut. She dragged the injured soldier toward the aid station, heart pounding. As she cleared the doorway, a round smacked into the frame where her head had been a split second before. Inside, she dumped the casualty onto a cot and yelled for one of the partner force medics to help. They trained together enough that he snapped into action, hands moving where she pointed. She stuck her head back out for a split second, scanning. Navarro barreled across the courtyard toward the armory, rounds chasing his boots. A comms tech staggered out of the ruined hut, clutching his arm, blood streaming between his fingers. Doc sprinted to meet him. "They hit the dish first," he gasped as she slapped a tourniquet above the wound. "Not the barracks, not the vehicles. They went straight for the uplink and the generator. Which means the uplink matters more than we do, she said grimly. They want what's in that box. What's in that box was terabytes of encrypted imagery, logs of drone flights, communications recordings, a treasure trove of intelligence if someone could crack it. If somebody walked away with those drives, people died. Not here, necessarily. Later, in different valleys, on different nights, unaware that their names and habits were cataloged in stolen files. Get him inside, she told the partner medic. Keep him talking. The next mortar round hit close enough to make her ears ring. It threw her sideways into a wall. For a moment, the world became muted, like someone had thrown a blanket over the sound. As her hearing slowly came back in broken pieces, she heard screams. Man down. Chief is hit. Patrols in the wash. They're getting hammered. Where's Guardian? Where's? She stumbled to the interior, past men firing from behind sandbags, past another casualty dragging himself by his elbows. Inside the aid station, there were already more bodies on the cots than she had beds. Blood smeared the floor. The air smelled of sweat and antiseptic and cordite. She triaged without thinking. That one stays. That one goes. That one. She hesitated a fraction of a second over a partner force kid with a chest wound, then moved on. There was no time to save everyone. She had to choose. Outside, smoke from a burning vehicle drifted across the compound, thick and black, mixing with the dust from impacts. Visibility dropped fast. Shadows moved in the haze, men rushing, ducking, firing. On the roof, Ruiz lay prone behind his rifle, muzzle steady. He picked targets where he could, punching rounds into muzzle flashes on the ridge. Then a lucky burst from an enemy machine gun swept the parapet. Concrete shards peppered his face. The optics glass shattered with a bright, crystalline pop. He felt a hot sting in his eyes and rolled to the side, cursing. Everything blurred into red and gray. Can't see, he shouted, hands flying to his face. I can't. He groped blindly for the rifle, fingers tangling in sling and bipod. Somewhere below, Doc heard him. She also heard the plates on the far wall of the aid station rattle as another mortar walked closer. The impacts were shifting, tightening. Whoever was on that tube was adjusting, step by step, zeroing in on the cluster of wounded around her station. Doc, one of the SEALs shouted as he ducked in, half carrying, half dragging another man. We gotta move these guys. They're bracketing you. She looked at the beds, at the pale faces, eyes wide, lips moving without sound. At the blood-soaked bandages, the improvised splints. Move them where? There was no deeper bunker, no safe room. The aid station was supposed to be the safe place. Now it was a painted target. Help me. Navarro's voice boomed from outside. She ran back into the yard. The chief lay on the ground near the center of the compound, one leg twisted, blood soaking his side. Mason was nowhere in sight. Hines knelt over Navarro, trying to slide a litter underneath him while bullets chewed the dirt around them. Doc, Navarro barked when he saw her. You got bigger problems than me. Mortars are tracking your building. Yell, my supplies are in my building, she snapped. So you get on this litter, or I swear to God I will sedate you and use you as a sandbag. He laughed once, then grunted as pain ripped through him. You're a ray of sunshine. Shut up, she said, and jammed a needle into his arm. Smoke from the burning vehicle drifted across them in a thick wave, cutting visibility further. The compound became a shifting ghost world of shadows and flashes, like a bad memory. As she and Hines lifted Navarro, a burst of gunfire tore through the smoke and slapped into the wall behind them. Chips rained down. She felt the hot wind of a bullet pass close enough to tug at a strand of hair. Something metallic bounced into the yard near the comm's hut. She instinctively ducked. It wasn't a grenade. It was a small, boxy device with stubby antennas. It clattered to a stop and smoked faintly. Jammer, Hines said, eyes widening. They're boosting from the outside now. We're sealed in. Doc glanced at the broken optic glinting on the rooftop above, then at the plumes of dirt stepping closer to her door. The math was shifting in her head, faster than she liked. We can't stay clustered here, she said. They'll drop a round right on this spot. They're pushing us where they want us. And where the hell are we supposed to go? Hines demanded. Smoke swirled again, opening a brief window toward the ridge. She could see the flashes of the mortar position now, just beyond the crest. See the silhouettes of the machine gun teams along the spine. See the glint of metal where a radio antenna poked up, too high for small arms to reach effectively from the ground, too far for anyone to sprint, unless they changed the angle. Her gaze drifted up, past the jagged edges of the compound's walls, to the rooftop access she'd locked the night before. Ruiz's curses drifted down from above, thin and panicked. Her stomach twisted. Her pulse slowed, because suddenly there was the path she'd spent years avoiding, the one that led back to a rifle, a scope, and the choice she'd sworn never to face again. Outside the wire, in the wash, the patrol was getting slaughtered. Inside, her aid station was turning from sanctuary to kill box. The enemy was focused on the uplink and the drives, yes, but to get them, they'd kill everybody in between, and she had a skill set nobody else here had. Doc, Hines said, seeing something shift in her eyes. What are you thinking? She looked at him, at Navarro, at the rows of wounded, then at the roof. I'm thinking, she said quietly, that if somebody doesn't start shutting down those guns, this aid station is going to be nothing but a crater. The next mortar round landed so close it rattled her teeth. Dust fell from the ceiling in a fine powder. Somewhere behind the clinic, someone screamed, high and raw, then cut off. Doc stood in the doorway of the aid station, fingers gripping the metal frame hard enough to hurt. The world outside was a torn painting, smoke drifting in ragged sheets, flashes of muzzle fire, the silhouettes of men running, stumbling, dragging. She knew, on a level deeper than thought, that the math had turned. The enemy had moved from suppression to eradication. They weren't just keeping heads down anymore. They were tightening the loop around the aid station and the comms hut, pressure squeezing in from all sides. If nothing changed, everybody inside the wire would be dead or wounded within minutes. There would be no one left to defend the drives, let alone the men. Her place was with the wounded. That's what every stripe on her sleeve said. That's what the cross on her vest meant. But her place was also wherever she was the most use. She looked up at the roof again. Ruiz's voice floated down, ragged. Doc, I can't see anything. Somebody needs to. Another burst of fire stitched the parapet above him. He flinched instinctively. The long rifle clunked as it shifted on its bipod, abandoned. Ruiz, stay down, she yelled. Get as low as you can. Can't do much lower, Doc, he shouted back, a manic edge creeping into his voice. Behind her, Navarro groaned on a cot, half-conscious. Hines stood over him, one hand pressed to a dressing, the other on his rifle. You want me to go up? Hines asked. I can. Can you hit a radio operator at 600 through smoke with a busted optic? She asked calmly. He hesitated. Maybe on a good. She gave him a look that made him close his mouth. I need you here, she said. If this goes sideways, these guys need someone who knows what they're doing. Doc, he started. She didn't let him finish. Listen to me, she said. You remember the drills. I left notes on each patient's chart. If I'm not back, you follow the notes. You keep them breathing. You don't let the little ones die, just because the big ones bleed louder. He stared at her as if seeing her for the first time. Where are you going? She glanced up. For a walk, she said. She moved fast before she could talk herself out of it. First, she stabilized what she could. She had the partner medics elevate legs, maintain pressure, keep airways clear. She checked Navarro's foreline, made sure the morphine was in, but not too much. Navarro's hand shot out and grabbed her wrist with surprising strength. What are you doing, Doc? Trying to keep you alive, she said. Liar, he grunted. That look on your face? That's not a for look. That's I'm about to do something stupid and brave look. Maybe it's both, she said. You told Mason he's calling it now. Well, I'm calling this. We're staying here, we die here. You leave, you might still die, he said. She gave him a thin smile. Yeah, but my odds add up better up there. He squeezed her wrist. If you're going to do it fast. Don't give yourself time to think. Thinking is where the ghosts live. She nodded once. You would know. She scribbled quick notes on the whiteboard above the cots. Who was circling the drain, who was stable enough to be moved if they got another lull. Then she stepped out into the yard again. The roof access from inside was blocked. The last mortar hit had dropped part of the hut's ceiling, and debris now choked the interior ladder. She tested it, kicked at the broken metal, realized she'd waste precious minutes trying to clear it. She needed another route. Her eyes swept the compound, searching for possibilities. The outer wall ran around 3 sides, with a gap where the gate had once stood before a vehicle now burned across it. The roof of the clinic and the comms hut sat just inside that wall, a meter or so higher. On the far side, near the corner, a drainage channel cut along the base of the wall. A narrow strip of concrete, half choked with mud and trash, sloped down to carry rainwater away in wet season. It ended near a section of wall where the mortar blasts had cracked the concrete and exposed chunks of rough masonry. If she could get into that channel, crawl along it to the corner, she might be able to climb the broken masonry up to the roof. It would be tight. It would be exposed for part of the climb. But the enemy's main fire seemed focused on the center of the compound and the wash beyond. Their angles might not give them a clean shot along that narrow gutter. Perfect, she muttered. That's exactly the amount of awful I was looking for. She ran low across the yard, timing her movement between bursts of fire as best she could. A round skipped off the ground near her boots, showering her with dirt. Another smacked into the wall above her, throwing chips down the back of her neck. She ignored the hot sting and dove into the drainage ditch. The channel was barely wide enough for her shoulders. Mud sucked at her elbows. The bottom was slick and slimy. Trash, old food wrappers, a crushed bottle, a rusted tin, dug into her ribs. She pressed herself as low as she could and started crawling. Above her, rounds slapped into the wall with a savage, stuttering rhythm. The concrete vibrated under her palms. Every impact sent little showers of grit down onto her back. At this range, even a stray round skipping into the ditch would be enough. But the geometry was on her side for once. The wall, the angle of the ridge, the thickness of the smoke, together, they gave her a thread to follow. The world narrowed to the stretch of concrete in front of her face and the rasp of her own breathing. Her mind tried to take her other places. To a different throat-tight channel. Another time she'd crawled into a bad spot with a rifle on her back. To a course where instructors' voices had barked in her ears about wind and mirage and never letting fear touch her trigger finger. She shoved the memories aside. There would be time for ghosts later, if she was lucky. Halfway along the ditch, a mortar round hit close enough to lift her, literally, off her elbows. The shock wave slammed her into the side of the channel, pain flaring in her shoulder. Her radio antenna, sticking up just slightly above the lip of the ditch, snagged on a jag of concrete. As she lurched sideways, it tore free with a harsh metallic snap. She froze, heart spiking. The headset in her ear went dead. Local net, long range, everything. The thin line that tied her into whatever remained of the platoon's communication cut in an instant. She lay there for a second, chest heaving, feeling the absurd urge to go back and pick it up and plug it in again, as if she could tape severed metal together and make it whole. "You're on your own now," a voice in her head said. "Feels familiar, doesn't it?" She pushed herself forward. The ditch ended near the corner, where the outer wall had cracked. The concrete here was broken into rough steps and ledges, exposed rebar jutting like rusted bones. Above, through drifting smoke, she could see the edge of the roof, jagged where part of the parapet had blown away. She wiped one filthy hand on her pant leg, flexed her fingers, and reached up for the first handhold. In another life, before the Navy, before the courses and the deployments and the transfer to medical, she had climbed limestone cliffs outside a small town with her cousins. Bare toes on tiny nubs, fingertips clinging to micro edges, bodies trusting friction and practice. Those old moves came back now, translated through boots and gloves and 30 extra pounds of gear. She wedged the toe of her boot into a crack, pulled up, reached for a bit of protruding rebar. The metal dug into her palm. She ignored it, focusing on 3 points of contact on balance. Above, a bullet smacked into the wall somewhere to her left. Tiny shards ricocheted, stinging her cheek. Another round hit higher up, sending a cascade of dust down. Don't look up, she told herself. Don't look down. Just look at your hands. She moved with deliberate slowness. Not because she wanted to, but because the climb demanded it. A rushed movement here would mean a slip, and a slip would mean pitching back into the open yard, presenting her entire body to the ridge like a gift. Halfway up, her right hand slipped on a patch of dust. For a heartbeat, her weight shifted into nothingness. Her stomach dropped. Her fingers scrabbled. She heard, faintly, another rifle crack from somewhere above and beyond, and a distant shout. Her left hand found purchase. She pinned herself against the wall, chest pressed to rough stone, lungs burning. She rested her forehead against the warm concrete for one long breath. Not like this, she whispered. You don't get a win like this. She resumed the climb. A few moments later, though it felt like hours, her fingers reached up and touched the rough edge of the parapet. She hauled herself up, arms trembling, and rolled onto the roof. Smoke lay across the surface in a thin veil. Spent casings glittered in the dust. The air up here tasted of cordite and something metallic. Doc, Ruiz's voice came from a few feet away, hoarse and small. Doc, that you? She crawled toward the sound. He lay on his back, hands still clamped over his eyes. Blood trickled between his fingers from a dozen tiny cuts. The long rifle sat a foot away, its optic a shattered ruin. I can't see anything, he said. It's all red and blurry. Did we lose the dish? I heard something. She grabbed his wrist. Hey, look at me. He dropped his hands. His eyes were bloodshot, pupils blown, glass dust stuck in the lashes. Don't try to open them, she ordered. You're not going to like what you see yet. I need you to roll over, crawl to the stair hatch, and stay as low as you can. Stairs are blocked, he said, voice cracking. Something collapsed. Of course they were. Okay, she said. Then you're going to crawl toward the corner over there, and I'm going to find you another way down when this quiets a little. You hear me? You hug that roof like it's your mom. He let out a watery laugh. Copy that. She pressed a field dressing into his hand and guided it to his face. Hold that there. Gentle pressure. If you hear me cursing, it means I'm still alive. Yes, ma'am, he said. She squeezed his shoulder and turned to the rifle. It rested on its mat, barrel pointed toward the ridgeline. The optic was a spiderweb mess. One lens starburst, the other caved in. She tested the screws, the mounts. The body was solid, but the glass was ruined. Of course you're broken, she muttered. Why would anything be easy? She lifted the rifle and moved toward the corner of the roof with the best view of the ridge. A row of sandbags along the parapet provided a little cover. From here, she could see beyond the wash to the opposite slope, where the enemy had set up their mortar and machine gun teams. They were clear enough, in the breaks in the smoke, to identify. Not crisp, but visible. She settled behind the sandbags and laid the rifle along the parapet. For a moment, her body rebelled. The stock against her shoulder felt like a confession. The weight of the barrel might as well have been her past, hauled up out of the locker where she'd locked it. Her cheek brushed the comb. Her eye lined up roughly behind the shattered optic. She closed it again. In her mind, she was back on that other range. The student beside her. The instructor calling out wind, distance, elevation. The odd, sick moment when a target silhouette had moved where it shouldn't have. A shape stepped into a line it wasn't meant to step into. Her finger tightening anyway, conditioned by habit and cadence, sending a bullet where it should never have gone. The shout, the scramble, the blood. She'd requested the transfer to medical 3 days later. Not because of one mistake, she told them. Because that mistake showed me who I am. I shouldn't be behind a rifle. My hands are for patching holes, not making them. Now, those same hands rested on the rifle again. Below, men screamed. Mortars walked closer. The aid station she'd stocked so carefully shook under impacts. You already made your choice, Navarro had said without saying it. You can let them die by degrees, or you can pick up the tool you don't want and try to change the ending. Her stomach fluttered. Her pulse pounded in her ears. She drew in a slow breath. Let out. Found a heartbeat between beats. Okay, she whispered. One more time. Just one more time. Her cheeks settled to the stock. I peered through the least damaged section of the optic, where a wedge of glass still offered a partial view. The crosshairs were warped, distorted by cracks. The picture was ugly, but it was still a picture. She pulled a roll of medical tape from her vest and wrapped it around the stock near her cheek, scribbling rough marks on it with a pen. Estimates of holdover, based on her memory, on the drop charts she'd once memorized and swore she'd forgotten. Wind was coming from the sea, low and inconsistent. Distance to the mortar position, 600, give or take. She tested the elevation knob. It turned, but the click stops were mushy. She abandoned that and went by feel. No spotter, no rangefinder, no second chances. Fear sat in her chest like a stone. She put it in the same box she put every other feeling when she worked on a trauma patient and started scanning for her first target. Through the shattered optic, the world looked fractured. The ridgeline was a series of broken shapes, chunks of rock, haze, the dark smudges of men scrambling. The cracks in the glass caught the light and threw odd flares across the image. If she stared too long, it felt like looking through ice. Doc made herself see past it. She forced her breathing into a slow, deliberate rhythm. In, out, in, out. Each inhale inflated her chest against the stock. Each exhale steadied her. Her eye tracked the mortar team first. The tube itself stood out, a darker cylinder angled toward the sky. 3 men clustered around it. One dropped shells into the tube with mechanical precision. Another knelt with a notebook or range card, calling adjustments. The third watched the impacts, shouting corrections and pointing. The spotter. That one was the brain. She shifted slightly, letting the crosshairs float over the spotting man's chest. The broken optic magnified the tremor in her hands. The reticle wobbled. She dug her left elbow into the roof, firming her platform, and rolled her shoulder slightly to lock into the sandbag. The wobble decreased. On the far ridge, the spotter pointed, lips forming words she couldn't hear. He turned his head just enough to present the thin side of his neck. She exhaled halfway and stopped. The world tunneled down to that patch of skin. Her finger tightened. The shot broke. The recoil drove the buttstock in her shoulder, sharp and solid. The muzzle blast kicked dust from the parapet. The sound crackled across the valley, cutting through the background roar. Through the broken glass, she saw the spotter jerk. For a second, his body stayed upright, as if trying to remember what it was supposed to do. Then his knees folded. He went down on his side, arms flopping loose. The man with the range card spun toward him, mouth open in a shout. She adjusted. The second shot came faster. It felt like stepping onto a moving train. The round hit the paperman's center mass. He arched backward and collapsed across the mortar plate. The firing man froze, eyes wide, hands still clutching the next shell. Mortars stopped marching. Okay, she muttered. That's 2. She shifted her view. Downslope from the mortar, a heavy machine gun hammered away. Its barrel glowed faintly from heat. A team worked it in smooth choreography, gunner on the trigger, assistant feeding the belt, another man spotting. Their fire poured into the wash where Mason's team had been. Even with the ghost shots helping, the guns still dominated that section of the battlefield. She watched the rhythm of their bursts. For seconds on, 3 off. The assistant glanced down to check the belt, then back up. The spotter pointed. She saw a gap. She angled the crosshairs toward the assistant. A dead gunner could be replaced. A missing belt feed could jam an entire rhythm. Inhale. Exhale. The optics cracks shivered, but she found the zone between them where the image was clearest. Shot. The assistant jerked violently, hands flinging open. The belt spilled from his fingers. He toppled backward off the gun pit. The gunner, reflexes drilled, tried to keep firing. The belt jumped and twisted, the feeder arm clacking on empty rounds. The gun choke, cough, stopped. Doc shifted again. Below, on the far side of the wash, a small team moved low and fast. One man carried a tube on his shoulder, another RPG. Another held the spare round. A third scanned with a pair of cheap binoculars. She recognized their intention instantly. The earlier RPG team had died suddenly and inexplicably. These guys were moving with more caution, hugging cover. But their goal was the same. Send an explosive into the heart of the trapped platoon. She tracked them as they darted behind a rock, waited, then broke for the next piece of cover. The broken optic tried to trick her, refracting shapes oddly as they crossed cracks. She mentally corrected, compensating for the distortions. The RPG gunner paused, crouched behind a jag of stone, then edged his head and shoulder out, tube rising. She led him by a hair and pressed the trigger. The round caught him above the jawline. His head snapped back. The tube fell from his shoulder, clattering off the rock and rolling down the slope. The loader stared for a heartbeat too long. By the time he thought to dive, her next shot was already on the way. He pitched forward, arms flung out. She didn't dwell on the bodies. She moved. The radio operators on the ridge drew her eye next. They were the ones feeding corrections, calling for more fire, coordinating the smaller teams into a coherent attack. She saw one kneeling behind a rock, handset pressed to his ear, cord trailing to a pack. His head was tilted, focused. Completely unaware, he had finally become someone's priority. The shot that took him felt almost too easy. Below, in the wash, the pressure eased momentarily. The overlapping arcs of fire that had made movement impossible went ragged, then fractured. In the riverbed, a seal dragged another toward a shallow shelf of rock. He felt a line of bullets stitch the dirt just ahead of him, then stop. He glanced up, saw a figure on the ridge drop unexpectedly. "Somebody's up there," he gasped. "Somebody's hunting them." Dot barely heard any of that. Her world was reduced to targets and timing. She shifted again, looking for the jammer. The small box they'd tossed into the compound yard was one node. But jam bubbles like this usually had a higher power unit somewhere with a better line of sight. She scanned the far slope through the broken glass. There, tucked behind a low stone wall, partly covered with a tarp, sat a truck with an odd antenna array on its bed. Cables ran from the equipment to generators. A man in a headset moved between them, hands flickering over controls. The truck was positioned cleverly, using terrain to break its outline from most perspectives. But from her improvised rooftop nest, at this angle she had a bead. The gap in the wall was narrow, just a sliver. She tested the holdover with a quick shot at a nearby rock. The round hit low, kicking up a puff of dust. She added a hair more elevation, adjusted her mental tape mark, and waited for the operator to step into the gap. Below, in the yard, something new buzzed. A small quadcopter drone zipped up from behind a building on the enemy side. It hovered for a moment, then began drifting across the valley, cameras searching. Someone on the ridge had decided they wanted eyes on the unexplained shooter. Doc saw it rise over the compound, a tiny insect against the smoke. If it spotted her muzzle flashes, she would become the priority. The ridge would focus their remaining fire on this roof until nothing but scorched concrete remained. She had maybe 3 seconds to decide. She shifted off the jammer for just a moment, tracking the drone as it bobbed. When it crested the parapet, less than 50 meters away, she saw the bright eye of its camera, the plastic arm spinning. She exhaled and shot it. The drone exploded in a puff of fragments, the pieces clattering onto the roof and into the yard below. "One less problem," she muttered. In the wash, Navarro, fading in and out of consciousness, grinned faintly when the buzzing sound cut off. "Nice swat," he murmured. The enemy adapted quickly. Unable to find her through the drone, they sent flesh. She heard them before she saw them. Faint scraping, the clink of gear on stone, the muted murmur of voices below the level of the roof. They were coming up the same broken masonry corner she'd used. Her ammunition situation was not ideal. The long rifle's magazines were limited. Down on the floor of the clinic, spare ammo sat stacked neatly in cases, more weight than she'd dared haul up on the climb. She'd check her mag. A few rounds gone already. She'd been efficient, but every pull of the trigger was expensive now. She couldn't afford to burn precious rounds on close targets. She could handle another way. She slid back from the parapet, scooped up her carbine from where she'd left it near the hatch, and moved low toward the corner. The first enemy climber's helmet appeared over the lip of the wall, slowly, cautiously. He rested one hand on the broken edge, fingers flexing. She planted her boot where his hand was and stomped. He yelped, grip breaking. His head popped fully into view in reflex. She put 2 quick shots into his forehead with the carbine. His body pitched backward, slamming into the man below him. They both tumbled, arms and legs tangling, falling in a cursing, flailing knot. She heard them hit the ground with a pair of wet thuds. More shouting, more scrambling. "Sorry," she muttered. "Find another ladder." She crawled back to the rifle. Her chest hurt with each breath. Her shoulder throbbed. Her hands were starting to shake in a way that had nothing to do with recoil. She forced herself to breathe slower. On the far slope, the jammer operator stepped out from behind the stone wall, headset askew. He bent over a control box, frustration in every line of his body. He was half facing her, right side exposed. The gap between the broken rocks framed his chest like a shooting lane on a qualification course. In the riverbed, Hines was shouting into a suddenly flickering radio. "Guardian, this is Viper 1-2. If you can hear this." The net was still a wall of silence, but he kept calling. Doc settled the warped crosshairs on the operator's ribs. The cracked glass refracted his outline oddly, splitting him into overlapping ghosts. She picked one and trusted the muscle memory she hated. She squeezed. The round slipped through the gap and hit the man just above the heart. He arched backward, arms flung wide, headset flying. He crashed into the equipment, dragging cables down with him. The generator sparked, sputtered, then went dark. For a heartbeat, nothing obvious changed. Then, in Mason's ear, there was a crackle. This is Thunder 3. We're reading a partial break-in." "Say again? Say again," Hines shouted, twisting the dial on his handset. The static thinned. A voice came through, ragged but audible. "Viper, this is Guardian," Klein's strained voice transmitted, full of relief and panic. "We got a narrow window. Jamming just dropped on part of the band. We're back on with higher for now." Doc heard it too, the faint echo of voices in her headset, even without an antenna. She let out a breath she didn't know she was holding. "Use it," she whispered. In the operations center miles away, an officer stared at a suddenly blinking icon over the valley. "We've got them," he said. "Patch them in. Scramble CAS. Now." A pair of aircraft peeled off their holding pattern. On the roof, Doc went back to work. She prioritized ruthlessly. An enemy squad, trying to flank the compound, got 2 quick shots to their point man and rear security, the middle scattering without cohesion. Another machine gun nest, repositioned, took a round through its ammo bearer. The belt dropped. The gun stalled. She chose not to shoot one particular corner of the village where she saw movement through the scope, a cluster of civilians huddled in a low, mud brick house not far from a firing position. If she directed the aircraft there later, those people would die. She wouldn't be the one to write that line in the after-action. "Come on," she murmured. "Run. Get out of there while you can." As if they heard, the family darted from the rear of the house in a brief gap between bursts, sprinting toward an alley. She sent a round into the wall above the enemy position to keep their heads down until the civilians squeezed through and vanished. It cost her a shot she could have spent on a more lethal target. She accepted the trade. Down below, Hines and the surviving SEALs felt the change like shifting weather. "As soon as the birds are on station, we need marks," the pilot's voice crackled over the net. "Call your friendlies, call your enemy strong points. Confirm no civilians in target boxes." "Copy all," Hines said. He looked up toward the roof. "We got a shooter up there who's been doing our homework," he said in his mic. "We'll ride their wave." Doc heard the call for marks. She saw the shape of the aircraft as dark triangles high above, faint against the sky. She clicked her radio twice, unable to send voice, but hoping the little burst might carry enough to mean, "I'm here. Watch my impacts." She picked the most dangerous remaining positions. 2 machine gun nests dug into the ridge, 1 cluster of fighters near the comm's hut line of advance, and started firing not to kill, but to trace. She deliberately aimed slightly off, stitching rounds in a line that would look distinctive from above, guiding eyes. "See those impacts?" the pilot asked. "Affirm, we got eyes on linear marks." "That's us," Hines said. "Friendlies are in the wash in the compound. Danger close. Bring it behind those marks." "Danger close authorized," the pilot confirmed. Mason, half blind on a litter, took the handset when someone pressed it into his hand. "Authorized," he said. His voice was raw but steady. "We're dead anyway if you don't." Doc watched the first run with a strange sense of detachment. The aircraft screamed in low, engines roaring. For a heartbeat, there was silence, a stretched pause as the ordnance fell, invisible. Then the ridge erupted. Precision strikes walked along the crest, blasting rock and earth into the air, shredding dug-in positions. The heavy guns that had dominated the wash vanished in plumes of dust and fire. The concussion hit Doc a moment later, a rolling pressure wave that rolled over the roof. She ducked behind the sandbags, teeth rattling. She popped back up, scanning. Through the new craters, a few enemy fighters stumbled, disoriented. She picked off a pair who tried to rally toward the mortar tube. As she pivoted, she saw him. Not by insignia or radio, by behavior. He stood slightly apart, barking orders with his hands, trying to pull scattered men into some kind of order. Even under fire, he moved with authority. Field commander. He grabbed a younger fighter by the collar and shoved him toward a weapon. The man balked. The commander turned, slapped him, tried again. Doc knew what would happen if he succeeded. The attack, which was starting to crumble, could be stiffened, pushed into something like a second wave. She lined the warped crosshairs up on the commander's chest. This shot mattered differently. It was not about one less rifle. It was about severing the last strand of a plan that had started long before this morning. She inhaled, exhaled, and held. Her trigger broke clean. The round crossed the valley and punched into the commander's sternum. He jerked, eyes wide, hand flying to the new dark circle blooming on his chest. For a surreal second, he looked right toward her roof, almost as if he could see the path of that bullet back to its source. Then he fell backward, arms flung out, and lay still. The fighters around him faltered. One dropped his weapon entirely and ran. Another followed. Within seconds, the coordinated attack disintegrated into a disorganized retreat, men scrambling back down the far slope, abandoning equipment. Aircraft made one more pass, hitting the remaining heavy points. Then the valley was left with a strange, ringing quiet, broken only by scattered gunfire and the moans of the wounded. Doc lay with her cheek on the stock, chest heaving, barrel smoking faintly in front of her. Her shoulder throbbed with each heartbeat. Sweat stung her eyes. She checked her mag. Last round. Down in the riverbed, two figures moved through the dust. One limped heavily, leaning on the other, arm slung over a shoulder. They stumbled, fell, got back up. Enemy fire still licked at them from a stubborn little knot of fighters. Doc rolled the rifle, aligning the cracked optic on that knot. She had one more coin to spend. She chose the man whose muzzle tracked closest to her stumbling teammates. Her vision tunneled, breath in, breath out. The shot felt like it came from somewhere else, like she was just borrowing another version of herself one last time. It cut the last shooter down. Down in the wash, the limping SEAL and his helper scrambled the last few meters into the lee of a big boulder, where others reached out and dragged them in. The bolt on her rifle slid back and stayed there, empty. She lowered her head to the stock, suddenly very tired. Quiet after the storm. Debrief, cost, and the legend of just the nurse. When the last echoes of gunfire faded, the valley felt indecently quiet. Smoke hung low over the outpost, drifting in layers that caught the early afternoon light. The smell was a blend of burnt fuel, spent propellant, and the copper tang of blood. Medevac birds came and staggered, cautious at first, then bolder when it became clear the ridges were no longer spitting death. Rotor wash blew dust through the compound, whipping torn tarps and making small fires gutter out. Doc moved among the wounded like she was back in a normal trauma bay, except nothing about this was normal. Her hands were steady as she started IVs, checked airways, reassessed tourniquets. Her voice was calm and precise. She did not look like someone who had just killed more men in an hour than most infantry would in a tour. Navarro watched her from his litter, one eye cracked open. He saw her flinch only once when a crewman on the helicopter asked, "You guys have a sniper on contract or something?" Those hits on the ridge were surgical. Hines opened his mouth to answer, then glanced at Doc. She didn't look up. She just said, "We had what we needed," and moved on to the next casualty. Mason, eyes still red and gritty, but functioning again after a saline flush, lay on a stretcher nearby, waiting for evacuation. He watched her too. He saw the way she avoided the roof ladder with every fiber of her being. On the second bird out, they loaded the worst of the wounded. The rotor wash whipped her ponytail and flattened her fatigues to her frame. As she strapped a partner force kid to the litter hook, he grabbed her wrist weakly. "You pulled me out," he said in broken English. "Back there, in the yard. We pulled each other out," she said. He nodded, satisfied with that, and closed his eyes. In the afternoon, the compound quieted to a different kind of busy. Engineers checked the integrity of the walls. Intel specialists picked through the rubble of the comms hut, carefully retrieving hardened drives and half-melted equipment. Local partner forces patrolled the perimeter, wary and grim. Bodies, enemy and friendly, were tagged, recorded, moved. Doc finally stepped out of the aid station into a patch of shade and sat down hard on an ammo crate. Her legs were rubber. Her hands, which had barely trembled while pressing dressings and tying knots, shook now that there was nothing in them. She stared at those hands for a long moment. Mason approached on a crutch, one eye still a little bloodshot, bandage wrapped around his forehead. "Hey, Doc," he said. "You got a minute?" She didn't answer right away. Her gaze was somewhere else, across the valley, up toward the ridgeline, maybe farther. "Doc," he said again, softer. She blinked and looked up. "You should be lying down," she said automatically. "You took a lot of grit in those eyes." "They're only half mine anyway," he joked weakly. "Listen, there's something we need to talk about." She sighed. "If it's about my supply list, I already sent it. We're light on O-negative and I." "It's not about that," he said. He took a seat on the crate opposite her, wincing as his leg protested. He held a tablet in one hand. Some of Klein's recordings, downloaded before the uplink, went dark. Klein pulled some feed from the last few minutes before he had to kill the system, Mason said. "Plus, we got gun camera footage from the birds overhead." Intel stitched it together. He tapped the screen. She didn't want to look, but she did. On the display, the valley spread out in bird's-eye view. Tiny figures moved in the wash and on the ridge. Little flashes marked impacts. Lines traced arcs of fire. One particular line appeared again and again, a thread of single shots coming from the same compact rooftop in the outpost, reaching out across the valley to pluck specific men out of the chaos. RPG gunner, mortar spotter, radio operator, jammer tech, commander. From above, it looked almost clinical. "Must have been some contract sniper," she said, voice flat. "Funny thing," Mason said. "We don't have any contract snipers on this roster. We have one designated marksman." He swiped to another clip, who went down with glass in his eyes halfway through. He brought up a freeze frame drawn from one of the aircraft cameras. The image, though zoomed and grainy, showed the roof of the clinic. A prone figure behind a long rifle. Medical cross visible on the vest. Her vest. "She saved your team," she said quietly, eyes on the image. "Whoever she is, that's what matters." He didn't smile. "You were right about the villagers," he said instead. "Right about the wall marks. Right about the militia commander's new friends." His voice hardened. "Kareem's men turn on us at the worst possible point, with perfect timing. That's not bad luck. That's intel work." She said nothing. "In the debrief we just finished," he continued, "Intel walked us through some of what we know so far. The tech guys dug into the jammer fragments and the vector of their attack. The enemy had been watching this valley for weeks. Pattern of life analysis on our patrols, our check-ins, even our sleeping habits. They chose the exact 10-minute window when we were most exposed and least connected." He thumbed to another image, blurry photos recovered from a dead fighter's pocket. Shots of the outpost from a distance. Screenshots of what looked like intercepted metadata. "They didn't want to overrun us just for the fun of it," he said. "They wanted those drives from the comms hut. The ones with local informant lists buried in imagery tags. The ones with routing patterns for future convoys. They wanted to snag a few prisoners, maybe an officer or two, make a video for their feeds. This whole thing was a test. See how fast we react when someone jams, hits an outpost, and tries to walk out with our eyes and ears. She watched a grainy clip of men moving toward the comm's hut under fire, then being cut down by her own shots. She recognized the timing of her trigger in the way they fell. "And," she asked. "And they failed," he said. "Barely. Because someone, when doctrine and planning and all our pretty toys fell apart, picked up a rifle they didn't want and started cutting the brain out of the attack, one neuron at a time." He set the tablet aside. The weight of his gaze settled on her. "You're not going to put that in your report," she said. He snorted. "You know how this works. The official after-action will say something like, 'Effective precision fires from within the compound contributed to repelling the assault.' It won't name you. It won't list every impact. At most, it'll mention a corpsman acting outside normal scope of duty." "Good," she said. "That's more than enough." He studied her face. "Why?" "Because I already know what happens when you put my name and a rifle in the same sentence," she said. "It took me a long time to convince myself I didn't belong behind glass anymore. I'm not interested in building a legend that will drag me back there." He shook his head slowly. "You're not the only one who gets a say in what this means." She flexed her fingers, looking at the calluses. "You know why I left that course," she said. "You read the file." "Yeah," he said. "I also talked to one of your instructors once, back when I was at a different command. He didn't remember your name at first. Then he did, and he told me something." She raised an eyebrow. He said she was the only one in that class who cared more about the guy who got shot than about the perfect group on paper, Mason said. He said she wasn't weak. She just figured out early that her talent scared her. Doc looked away, jaw tight. "You froze once," Mason said. "Fine. You got someone hurt, and you let that define you. But what you did today," he gestured toward the valley, "that wasn't somebody running from fear. That was someone running at it, because the alternative was letting everybody else die." She swallowed. "Don't make it bigger than it is," she said. "I had a good angle. I had a rifle. I did math. That's all." "You also spared a house," he said. "Pilots say there was one compound they expected to hit based on patterns. You never marked it. Later we saw a family coming out of there after it all ended. You saw them. You made a choice." She exhaled slowly. "Who you kill matters," she said. "But who you don't, that sticks longer." He leaned forward. "I want it on record that when everything failed, the person who turned a massacre into a survivable disaster wasn't the guy with the map. It was the one everybody thought was just here to patch us up. You want on record for them," she said. "So they'll feel better about what happened, about who they lost." He looked uncomfortable, which told her he'd heard the truth in that. "Maybe," he admitted, "but also for you. You carry enough ghosts already. Might as well remind yourself you don't only make holes. Sometimes you stop them from happening in the first place." For a moment, neither of them spoke. On the ridge above, wind moved faintly through the blasted rocks. A torn tarp flapped against the wreck of the jammer truck, now just scorched metal. "Intel says they're going to adjust tactics now," Mason said after a while. "They saw how fast we got aircraft on station once the jammer went down. This was a test run. Their rehearsal didn't go as planned. That means some Operation Three Valleys over just got harder for them to pull off. Glad we could ruin their dress rehearsal," she said dryly. He smiled and sobered. "There's something else you should know. Word's already spreading." "About what?" she asked warily. "About the ghost on the ridge," he said. "Some of the guys are telling the story already. How they were pinned, how everything was going to hell, how rounds started dropping out of nowhere, hitting exactly the right people. They'll forget," she said. He tilted his head. "You've been around this community long enough to know we don't forget stories like that. We embellish them. They'll say there was a contract shooter passing through, or a mysterious overwatch no one ever saw clearly. You'll be the punchline, probably." Doc was so mad about us tracking blood on her floor that she called in a ghost to cover us. She huffed, despite herself. "The funny part," he added, "one of them, when they were dragging me under that shelf, swore they saw a medic's cross up there in the smoke. So now the rumor is that the ghost was wearing a red cross, like some kind of angel with a rifle." "That's a terrible rumor," she said. He shrugged. "It'll keep changing. That's what stories do. But the bones of it will stay. When some new guy is trying to decide whether to respect the quiet corpsman at the edge of the room, somebody's going to bring up the ghost medic who turned a battle with a handful of rounds and a busted scope. I don't need respect, she said. I need the right supplies and people who listen when I say I'm low on blood. He stood up, using his crutch. I'll make sure you get both. A few weeks later, at a stateside training range, a clutch of young operators gathered around a picnic table in the evening, nursing cheap coffee and comparing scars. One of the older guys who'd been there in the valley leaned back and said, "You ever hear about the nurse who saved a whole platoon because she got bored of waiting for evac?" They laughed. He told them about the valley, about the trap, about the way bullets had started landing like God had finally hired a real marksman. He talked about the broken optic, the impossible angle, the jammer dropping at exactly the right second. He left her name out, not because he forgot it, but because legends didn't need name tags. Point is, he finished, don't ever underestimate the quiet one sitting by the aid bag. Sometimes she's the only reason you get to complain about the food later. Across the training field, near the med tent, Doc checked a trainee's bandage, correcting the knot with a gentle tug. "That'll slip under sweat," she said. "Try this wrap instead. You want it to hold when things get messy." The trainee nodded, absorbing every word, eyes flicking to the small cross on her vest. In the distance, the sound of rifles drifted on the air, cracks and pops, regular and controlled. She listened for a moment, then turned back to her work. When everything falls apart, some people run for cover. Others run for what's needed most at that moment. A rifle, a tourniquet, a kind word, a plan. She'd been all of those at one time or another. The world would, inevitably, introduce her as just the nurse. She'd let it, because the people who mattered would know that titles didn't mean much when the valley turned into a kill zone and the radios went dead. What mattered was who picked up the right tool when nobody else could, and who kept other people breathing long enough to see the sun rise on the quiet after the storm.